Yeah, I'm back talking about extract brewing. But hey, you all grain brewers, don't you cook away yet. There's still plenty to learn. Well, let's get brewing. Well, welcome. I'm Brent from Cascades Homebrew. So this video is one of three talking about the topic of extract brewing with either steeping grains or with a partial mash. I know, sounds kind of boring, doesn't it? Well, I learned a lot along the way, and I'm sure you will too, so I have more ideas on how to integrate extract brewing with either steeping grains or partial mash into my brew cycle. So the other two videos that I put out, the first one was a grain to glass video of brewing a partial mash version of the Brave Noise Pale Ale. It turned out quite well. So the second video was more of a deep dive in the topics of mashing, partial mashing, steeping, when do you need to use a partial mash, what are the characteristics of grain that determine when you should mash them, what are the benefits of partial mash brewing. So as part of my dive into the topic, I brewed two batches of beer. Both were similar of the Brave Noise Pale Ale. One of them was extract with steeping grains, and one of them was extract with a partial mash. So in this video, I'm going to look a little closer at the differences of those beers, both on the brew day, and then we're going to taste them and compare them side by side. So on the video of the Brave Noise Pale Ale recipe, I talked about trying to increase diversity in homebrewing and homebrew clubs. Well, I recently signed up to be president of my homebrew club, the Warthogs. So at this point, we're really just trying to figure out how to get back into meeting in person and exchanging beers after these years of COVID. But as we start to ramp up, I'm definitely going to look for opportunities to increase diversity and make more welcome. So if you've had any ideas, things that have worked well for you and your homebrew club, make sure you let me know. So as I said, the first video talked about a partial mash of the Brave Noise Pale Ale. The last one talked a lot about mashing and partial mashing. So before I jump into the brew day on this one, I want to take a quicker look at just steeping grains. So in my last video I said if you're doing an extract batch with steeping grains like crystal or roasted malts, say like chocolate malt or black patent malt or roasted barley, which isn't a malt but it's a grain, you don't need to do a mash. Those are grains and malts that don't have starches that need to be broken down or converted, and they also don't have the enzymes that would be needed for conversion. And this is where I think there's a lot of confusion. I see a lot of recipes that are published, both in books, ones for sale, and the recipe sheets, that call for the steps needed for a partial mash when they're really just using grains that can be steeped. The downside of mashing is the extra time and efforts that's required, whereas when you're steeping, you really just need to add those steeping grains into cool water, let them warm up. You can really do that just during the normal brew day. I'll show an example of that in here just a minute. But when you're actually doing a mash or a partial mash, there are a couple things you need to pay special attention to. So two of the most important are temperature and time. The exact temperature of the mash isn't that critical, but there is a range that you're going to need to keep it. And that range is about 149 degrees Fahrenheit to 156 degrees Fahrenheit, or about 65 degrees Celsius to 67 degrees Celsius. That is the temperature range where the enzymes are most active and can break down those starches into sugars. Time is also important. The enzymes need time to work, usually at least 30 minutes, maybe even up to 60 minutes. So the requirement to heat the water up to a certain temperature, add the grains, and then let it sit for 30 to 60 minutes, that's going to add a bit of time to your brew day. It also may require a couple steps to try to keep that temperature a little steady. There's some other factors you might want to think about with mashing too. Sorry, my furnace came on. The thing can be pretty loud. I'll be right back. So there are a couple other issues that might be important with partial mashing. Some of this is based on my experience for years as an all-grain brewer doing mashing. So one of those is the water to grain ratio. I'd be worried if you're just putting a small amount of grain into a large amount of water, it may be too dilute for the enzymes to work. So a water to grain ratio that I would recommend is about for every pound of grain, using about a half a gallon of water up to a gallon of water. So somewhere in that range. So that would be for every 500 milligrams of grain, use about 2 liters to 4 liters of water. So in my brew day, I think I used half a gallon of water for 1 pound of grain. And with the flake grains, it tend to soak up a lot of water. So with flake grains, you may want to use a little bit more water. So another thing that may be important with partial mashing is water chemistry and pH. With all grain brewing, pH can be kind of important. It helps to support the enzyme conversion. It may be less critical with a partial mash, but it might be something to think about. And then water chemistry with a partial mash is probably a lot less important than it is with all grain brewing. But you want to make sure you're using at least quality water for your partial mash. Well, let's take a look at the steps required for an extract batch where we're just using steeping grains. And then we'll look at the brew day, where I did the Brave Noise Pale Ale, both as a steeping grain version and as a partial mash version. So walking through a simple process for steeping grains, in this example, I filled my kettle with 3 gallons or 11 liters of tap water. I figured this amount would be pretty typical for an extract batch. I then get the water heating toward boiling temps. My local tap water is treated with chlorine and chloramine, so I'm sure to add a bit of a Campton tablet. This is a very simple but important step if using treated tap water. 1 tablet is good for 20 gallons, so I crush about a quarter of a tablet, and then I stir it into the water. I'm using this reusable bag to hold my grain. For this example, I'm using 8 ounces, or about 230 grams, of Special B. Special B is a dark crystal malt that does not need to be mashed. Be sure to purchase crushed grains if you don't have your own mill. I load up the bag, try not to dump too much of the grain on my counter in the process. I tie up the bag and add it to the water, which at this point has been heating up for about 5 minutes. The goal is to let the grain steep in the water as it warms up. I want to give it 20 to 30 minutes, making sure to remove the grain before the water gets to around 180 degrees Fahrenheit, or about 82 degrees Celsius. So instead of a dedicated 30 to 60 minute mash, I'm just using the time it normally takes to heat up my brewing water. You can see that the grain is quickly adding colors to the brewing water. I set a 10-minute timer and then stop back in to check on the temperature of the water and to give the grain bag a few dunks in the water. You want to make sure you use a bag that's big enough that the grain is not compacted. At the 20-minute mark, you can see that the Special B has added a significant amount of color to the brewing water. I declare that the 20-minute steep is a success, and I go ahead and remove the grain bag. It's a good idea to let the majority of the water drain out of the grains. To squeeze or not to squeeze. The idea that squeezing will extract tannin seems to be a total myth, but there's no real need to go crazy with squeezing either. I give the bag a gentle squeeze to get out most of the liquid. I have noticed that if you're using a muslin bag, squeezing can push grain particles out of the material. That's probably something to avoid. Since I was just doing this steeping as an example, I pulled out a sample for a gravity reading. I showed a reading of 1.003, so I did get a few gravity points out of the steeping grain, but the main goal here is color and flavor. The sample has a wonderful amber color. A taste of the sample showed some raisin characters and a touch of sweetness that Special B is known for. I did dump this batch, but don't worry too much. For some reason, I thought ordering a 5-pound bag of Special B was a good idea. I may have used up 1 pound of that over the year, so no real loss here. Getting into the Brave Noise Pale Ale, I brewed 2 2.5 gallon batches, about 9.5 liters. Each had 2 pounds or 900 grams of Pilsen Light DME. They also each had 7 ounces or 200 grams of Crystal 15, 8 ounces or 225 grams of flaked oats. They both also had 8 ounces or 225 grams of wheat. One batch used malted wheat, and one batch used flaked wheat. As I discussed in my other video, the malted wheat provides the enzymes needed to support conversion of starches into sugars during the mash. This is the batch that I labeled a partial mash. The batch with just flaked wheat does not have enzymes to support conversion, so I label that batch just as steeping grains. For both batches, I followed the same process. That means for the steeping batch, I followed the same steps needed for the partial mash. I could have saved time by following the steeping process discussed earlier, but I followed the same steps to try and limit variables between the 2 batches. So I started by heating up a half a gallon, or just under 2 liters of water. I preheated my small beverage cooler with hot tap water, and then I added my grains. Note that I crushed the crystal and the malted wheat. The flaked oats and flaked wheat do not need to be milled, though some people do, but you definitely need to mill the crystal and the malted wheat. I then gave the mix a good stir. My target temperature was 152 degrees Fahrenheit, or 67 degrees Celsius. Both batches started pretty close to that target. I then sealed up the cooler and let it sit for 30 minutes. After the 30 minutes, I gave the mix another good stir, drained out the majority of the liquid from the grains, and then I dunked the grain bag several times in the heating brewing water. This acts like a sparge to help extract any colors, flavors, or sugars that are in the grains. I gave the grain bag a gentle squeeze to get out the majority of the liquid. The batch then just got a short boil. Besides the dry hop, the only hop addition in this batch was 1 ounce or 28 grams of Mosaic in a hop steep. Check out my first Brave Noise Pale Ale video for full information on the recipe. As far as looking at the differences between the two batches, the batch with the flaked wheat and flaked oats really sucked up the water, leaving something behind that looks similar to prepared oatmeal. The batch with the malted wheat, on the other hand, had a lot more liquid. I probably should have doubled the amount of water that I used to a full gallon, or about 4 liters of water. So I was a little inconsistent with my process and the pictures that I took here, but before each mass, I tested a sample with iodine. In the presence of starches, iodine will turn this dark purple color. As expected, both pre-mash samples turned a dark purple, indicating starches were present. So looking at the post-mash samples, there is quite a difference. The photo on the left is the batch with flaked wheat. There's a very noticeable bluish purple color, indicating a significant amount of starches are still present. The photo on the right is the batch with malted wheat. I used several drops of iodine, but the photo shows mostly the brown color of the iodine with just some streaks of dark purple. This indicates that there were still some starches present, but less than the other batch. I was expecting to see conversion of starches and sugars with the malted wheat, and these photos seem to show that. Also, as I had kind of expected, the gravity on the batch with flaked wheat came in a few points lower at 1040, where the batch with malted wheat came in 4 points higher at 1044. That was still a few points lower than my calculated expected gravity, but that's good enough. I split 1 pack of Lallemand verdant yeast between the 2 batches. The fermentation was very similar between the batches. The flaked wheat batch did have a more tan and creamy krausen than the malted wheat batch. I'm not sure I'd read too much into that difference though. The final gravity on both beers came in right around 1010. That would give the malted wheat version a little higher attenuation and a slightly higher ABV. It's always nice when I talk about theory, and then I have some beers to back up that theory. And hopefully what we see in the beers matches up with what I would call best practices, both steeping and mashing. Spoiler alert, they might not. So what I have here are the 2 beers. This is the one that is steeped, so it used both flaked oats and flaked wheat. This is the one that was the partial mash. So it had the flaked oats, but it had malted wheat in the grain. If we look at the appearance between the two, the color on them is really similar. These ones have been in the keg for a while. Some of the haze is dropping out, but they still have a pretty solid haze to them. It's very similar on both of them looking up at the lights. As far as the head on them, they're similar. I'm seeing a more of a creamy one in the steep one. It's kind of interesting. I think it might be more just this particular pour, but as we go in for aroma, so I've drank some of these. It's definitely been a little while since I brewed them. And interesting, the biggest difference that I noticed between them really is sort of in hop character. But I think that might be more from like kind of the base malty character and how that impacts the perception of hops. So I thought maybe the Sabro stood out a little bit too much in the partial mash beer. As I noted during the review of that one, where I always felt the Sabro was just a little bit more muted in the steep grain one. So one thing I would say about the batch is they both had 1 ounce of Sabro added in the dry hop. I had bought 2 1-ounce packs from my homebrew store. So they were different hop bags. I do wonder if there's some potential that hop character were different between those 2 bags of hops. Although I purchased them on the same day from the same store, so you would think they'd be very similar. And if you expect the mouthfeel to be the biggest difference, I think it actually is. It's kind of an interesting thing. So in theory, you shouldn't just steep malted wheat, you shouldn't just steep malted oats. But this one actually has a little bit more of a full mouthfeel, a little bit of that creaminess to it. It almost feels like a bigger beer than it is. When we looked at the stats, this one is actually like 4%. I think this one is 4.3%. It's a lower ABV beer. It started at a lower original gravity. So you would think it should be a thinner beer, but it actually has more mouthfeel to it. There's a lot of me that says that the steep version is actually just a better version of this beer. It's got a creamier texture. I feel like it's got a malty character that kind of balances out some of the hop character. You can see they're both nice and creamy, but this one, if you can see it, is actually sticking to the glass much more. It could just be the glass in the pour, but I've kind of noticed a little difference over the time. So I'm not 100% sure what my takeaway is from this one. So I definitely feel like extract-based, whether they're hoppy pale ales or New England IPAs, are potential. This is a really nice looking beer. They're both nice and clean. think they're both good beers, but I do think I really just kind of prefer the one with the steep grains better. Even though part of me tells me that that was a bad thing to do, it turned out to make a pretty nice beer. It's just nice and creamy, additional mouthfeel, especially for a 4% beer. It really tastes like a much bigger beer. So to some extent, was all the theory I said about what you should steep, what you shouldn't steep, what you have to mash, was that right? Was that wrong? I don't know. In this case, steeping malted oats and malted wheat made a pretty decent beer. Although part of me says you probably shouldn't do that. I guess moving forward, I'm interested in trying both. I'm also interested in kind of playing around with steeping other grains, some of the ones you're not supposed to steep. That might be kind of an interesting experiment as well. So in any case, I got to learn a little bit more about partial mashing, about some of the potential benefits for an extract brewer, or maybe for an all-grain brewer looking to make a simple brew day. And I also ended up with 2 really nice beers. Well, if you like this kind of content, make sure you subscribe. And also, check out some of my other content about experiments that I've done. And also, check out this video that YouTube thinks you should watch. And cheers!